Well, tonight I'm very happy to present to you Pyramids, Tombs and Treasures of Egypt. And we'll start right here in Cairo, the capital city of Cairo, and it's one of the big mega cities of Earth, and this is just introducing Egypt and this fabulous city. It really is a fabulous city. Of course, Egypt is a land of pyramids. It's a land of tombs, and also it's a fantastic place for treasures. No museum in the world has the amount of gold and treasures that Egypt has. This is the Luxor Temple complex in Egypt. That's down the Nile. And Egypt's a very fascinating and mysterious place. That's why when you advertise that you're going to speak on Egypt, people of all sorts of backgrounds love to come and to see this beautiful country. And here it's tranquil and beautiful. This was one of the first scenes I recall seeing when I went to Egypt. In fact, my first trip to Egypt was in 1982, and I went with David Down. And we were staying in this hotel, and just as we settled into the hotel, that was the view we got of the Nile, and there were the blossoms of the trees and the tourists coming home from the big temples in these hantours. Of course, the Nile is beautiful where it comes to these feluccas, these yachts. Everybody likes that. But the great riches, I think it is, that fascinates people more concerning Egypt. But while it's a place of great riches, it's also a place of great poverty. This is the Cairo Museum. And of course, every tourist that goes to Egypt always likes to go to the Cairo Museum, and you are reminded continually of the fact that Egypt is the oldest continually inhabited country in the world. And I think that adds to its tremendous fascination. Here is it has the longest line of kings of any nation in the world. Now, this is the Colossi of Memnon. Look at the size of them. Just to give you an idea of the size, that is me. These are about 40 feet high. In fact, it's called Colossi of Memnon because in Greek, Memnon means mother. And these great colossi, they are made of huge stones that have been carved, and during the day they expand with the heat, and then as the sun goes down and it gets cold, so the stones begin to contract. But they rub against each other and they make a sound that sounds like mom, sounds as if they're calling for their mother. So that's why they call them the Colossi of Memnon. These actually were the beginning of a great complex of temples by the pharaoh Amenhotep III. Now, Amenhotep III was the father of Akhenaten, who was really Amenhotep the fourth, but and he was a very fascinating person too. The chronology of Egypt has been divided into 31 dynasties, one after another, and it was devised by Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest about 300 years before Christ. Now, he was a pagan Egyptian priest, and he divided the history 31 dynasties. But what we've discovered now is that he made, I was going to say he made some mistakes. Perhaps it's historians that have made the mistakes because they've assumed that the dynasties went one after another. when in fact that some of the dynasties were ruling at the same time. And so you had some down in the lower part of Egypt and others in the north, and they were ruling at the same time. So instead of Egyptian history being like that, really what should happen is it should be contracted, because they were not always one after another. Sometimes there were two of them at the same time. In fact, Velikovsky, the Jewish historian, he maintains that Egyptian chronology should be contracted about 600 years at the time of the flood. And if that was done, immediately we would have a lot more biblical evidence for the, archaeological evidence proving the Bible true. And, the Bible has got a lot to say about Egypt. And we are introduced to it. Egypt is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 10. And this is what it says. Abram went down into Egypt. And it's very fascinating what happened when Abraham went down to Egypt. And we'll be having a look at that soon. This is the land of Egypt. And now you almost need to be Irish to understand Egypt. Because, you see, when you go up here, this is Lower Egypt. And when you go down here, that is Upper Egypt. Because, you see, the River Nile flows down from Africa. It flows down to the Mediterranean Sea. And so it's on the map, it's upper, but it's up, but it's really Lower Egypt. And if you go down to down the map, that's where you come to Upper Egypt. As I say, if you're Irish, it helps tremendously. I'm part Irish, so it's no problem to me. Okay, so I hope that might help to understand it a little bit more. Well, when you go there, of course, and you settle into your hotel in Cairo, of course, the first thing, you go to the window and you look out and you say, wow, where will the pyramids be? And I can still remember the thrill. We were up on, I think, on the 6th floor of our hotel, and we're looking through the smog. Oh dear. It's a mixture of the exhaust fumes and dust and filth of Egypt. But can you see there? How good is your eyesight? Can you see? And suddenly, wow! There's the pyramids. And we knew that next day, of course, we'd be taken to the pyramids. Since that time, I've taken two groups into Egypt and into Cairo. Well, in Egypt, there are still today 77 pyramids that you can visit. But the main pyramids that we speak about are these three big pyramids at Giza. Now, Giza is a southwestern suburb of Cairo. So it's only a few minutes' drive, really, from the centre of Cairo. Well, these are the Great Pyramids, and this is the names. These are the Greek names for the pyramids. You see, that was the father, this is the son, and this is the grandson. So that is Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus. But also you here have the Egyptian names, Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure there. And this was my first visit to the pyramids. David Down took that photo for me. It's awesome. You just stand there and, wow, 2,300,000 blocks. And I tell you what, they're not little stones by any means. I'll show you that in a moment. They're just amazing. And here the sides are 230 metres, forming a perfect square, a line due north, south, east and west. This is in itself very, very remarkable, because the dynasties before, see, this was the 4th dynasty. In the 3rd dynasty before, you should see the pyramid that was built. You know, when I was a boy growing up in Perth, we had an expression. Anything that was badly built, like a house, we'd say, this is the house that Jack built. Well, this poor old pyramid, you'd have said, this is the pyramid that Jack built. And then suddenly, you come to the 4th dynasty, and there are these pyramids beautifully set out. Then the Egyptians forgot fairly quickly, because you get to the 5th pyramid and things are sort of fall apart again. But we'll have a look at this. Anyhow, this is the entrance to this huge pyramid just here. And you tunnel through, and then you go up these passageways until you come right up here to the king's chamber. When you get up here, the pyramid robbers had been in long centuries before, and they'd broken the side of the sarcophagus, and it was empty. And whatever jewels and treasures were there, one could only guess. Just would have been fantastic that they would have taken. And here is something, air vent. Well, we're not quite sure what that is. Some folks maintain it lined up with the stars. It's very obvious that when these pyramids, these 3 great pyramids, was built, that they had a knowledge of astronomy that they'd never had before, and may I add, I don't think they've ever had since. There's one thing for sure, Egyptians could never build the pyramids today that they built 3,000 or more years ago. Well, here we are, you see. 2,300 blocks of stone, average weight 2.5 tons. Some were 15 tons. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that these bricks, or stones, call them what you like, they were quarried the other side of the Nile out of Tura limestone, and then they were transported across the Nile. How did they do that all those years ago? I mean, even today, the Egyptians, I think, would have big problems to be able to assemble stones that size. Well, of course, folks have often debated about how the pyramids were built. It's usually felt that they would have been built, that the workers used massive supply and construction ramps to manoeuvre large stone blocks into place. And they feel that they were dragged up, but they still are not sure actually how they did it. I remember taking a tour group into the Temple of Karnak, and on one of the big Karnak walls there, against the wall, were a lot of mud and straw bricks where they had been dragging the stones there and putting them into place. And here, this quote says, "The pyramid builders were expert engineers using construction techniques known only to them, a technological feat beyond comparison in either the ancient or the modern world." They just are in awe. How did they do it? You see, we are being brainwashed because of evolution. You know, that we came up from monkeys and so forth, and we've evolved. And of course, the idea is you go back to 3,000 years ago, they were cavemen and they didn't have it together. Much to the contrary. The Bible tells us that we were created in the image of man, and we have descended, not ascended. And when you go back to what these folks were 3,000 years ago, they were very, very brilliant. Well, this is the bent pyramid of Senefru. That's a very interesting one. The Pharaoh was building his pyramid. Well, that was his engineers anyhow. And suddenly they said, "Wow, we're going up too steep. We better change our direction." So that's how it ended up, the bent pyramid. But this is quite interesting because they had discovered, inscribed in one of the bricks here, it says that this was the level at the 21st year of the king. Then up here they've got another stone or brick, and it was inscribed that this was the 2nd year of the king. In other words, they had built that much of the pyramid in just a year. And of course, it's been debated, historians and others have debated how long it took to build the Great Pyramids of Giza. Was it 4 or 5 years to build? And, well, some maintain it would have been decades to build, but they feel it wasn't long like that. This is very interesting. This is Pharaoh Khufu's funerary boat, and this is marvellous. That is an air-conditioned museum. What happened was they had buried with the Pharaoh this boat, well, a number of them actually, but it was all in pieces. And they got to, and they assembled it all and made this boat. And so now you can go into this museum and you can walk around. And you see there's the windows there, and you can walk right around and have a look at this ancient boat. The idea was that this boat would take his soul to the happy hunting ground or there. Well, of course, when you go to the pyramids, you've got to have a look at the camels. And everybody likes to have a ride on a camel, and of course they come across and they, you know, it's amazing how many languages they can speak. And as soon as they pick up that you are English, they can talk English to you, or whatever language. And of course it's all, and they'll get their garb and they'll put it on you and get on our camel and so forth. And then of course it's all bakshish, but it's all part of it. I mean, it's a lot of fun. So, mind you, so of course I ended up on this camel. But this fellow, as soon as he knew I was an Australian, of course, overseas, Australians don't have a very good name. We're considered a beer, alcohol drinking crowd. So the fella comes up to me to try and impress me, and he said, "Wow," he said, "you're from Australia. Well, come on my camel. My camel's name is what? Whiskey." And I thought, you know, some of us are naturally stubborn, and I guess I'm one. So I looked at him and I said, "Look, I'm more like you, good Muslims. I don't drink alcohol." I thought, that'll sit him back. I wonder what he's going to say now. And as quick as anything, he said, "But my camel has 2 names. His other name is water." I said, "Okay." So I got on the camel, and he eventually got his bakshish, okay, and I got my pictures. Well, so much so. And of course, every tourist wants to visit the Sphinx. That is a very interesting statue, monument. It's 80 metres long, 23 metres high, and it's been carved out of a outcrop of stone here. It's a very, the type of sandstone is a very flimsy sort of sandstone. Fortunately, it has really been, it was preserved down through the years by sand that had blown and had buried it. At the time that Napoleon was there, it was just about covered. And this is what they've, since this time they've been trying to fix it up. After I did my first trip there was a great chunk that came out of the poor old Sphinx, and so they're trying to help it as best they can. But everybody, every tourist that goes there loves to go to a light and sound show. And you go and you just in an evening like this, and usually it's a hot sort of, well, it's a lovely evening after a warm day, and you're sitting there, and then they put the lights, you see, on the particular pyramids or the Sphinx, and then comes the voices, and it almost sends a chill down your spine to hear these voices, you see. And so the Sphinx starts, "I am the Sphinx. I have been looking over this area for 3,000 years. I remember," and so it goes on about I remember, you know, when Jesus came as a baby, and right through to all the things. And the interesting thing is, you see, that when Christ was a baby, the Sphinx was already about 2,000 years old then. You know, we don't often think in terms of how ancient these things were. But, of course, you go back long before the time of Christ to when Joseph was the ruler of Egypt, and the Sphinx and the pyramids were still some centuries on there. And then, of course, Moses, when he came and confronted the Pharaoh, the pyramids were there at that time. Well, this is possibly, they've made a reconstruction, but this is what they think the Sphinx originally looked like in all of its beauty. And it's very, very fascinating. The unlocking the Egyptian hieroglyphs by the Rosetta Stone. I'll never forget my first trip to the British Museum. It was 1983, and I'd been lecturing through Europe, and I had one day in Paris that the person who was taking me around, we're taking some ministers' meetings, he said to me, look, he said, I've been on itinerary. He said, could you fill in a day yourself? I said, sure thing. I said, I'm so close to England, I'd love to go across and see to see London and the British Museum. Oh, well, he said, that's not hard. He said, you can get a plane across, just an hour. And I remember I had a cousin working at our division office there, so I rang her up. Oh, yes, she said, you can stay with these folks and the rest of it. So the next thing is I had one day to see London. And I'll never forget telling my host, who was an Australian that was running a guest house there, I was going to see London in one day. And she looked at me and she said, you know, I've had visitors here from Australia and they have been here 3 weeks and they haven't seen all that they wanted to see. I said, well, I'm going to have a good go. And I had just 1.5 hours to see the British Museum. And I wanted to see the Neo-Babylonian area because, as some of you folks know, I've worked with my Jehovah's Witness friends. I wanted to get up there and see some of the tablets dealing with Nebuchadnezzar and the chronology back there. And I'm hurrying through. Suddenly, I looked at the side. Wow, there was the Rosetta Stone. And this stone I'd read about. You see, this stone was the one that unlocked the, helped the folks to be able to read the hieroglyphs. And what it was originally, it was a notice in 3 languages talking about, telling their rules and regulations. And it was... And finally, it was lost, and it was used as a front doorstep stone. And then Napoleon came, and with his troops in 1798. Does that sound very interesting to Adventists? 1798, the time of the end, when knowledge would run to and fro. And very interesting because that was the year the British came in, overthrew Napoleon and took from him the Rosetta Stone, and it was put into the British Museum. And so there it was, and it's in these 3 particular languages. You've got there the hieroglyphs and the Demotic and the Greek. And so when they realised that these were the same... said the same thing, but in these 3 different languages. Then they compared them, and this is how they unlocked the reading of it. Actually, what gave them the clue was, see, these are what are called cartouches, and these are the names of rulers. And one was the name Cleopatra, and the other one was her brother Ptolemy. And so they compared the signs and so forth, and as a result, Jean-Francois Champollion, he was the one that was able to unlock the things. And as a result of this, in fact, I studied in 1957 at Avondale College at the First Seminary Extension School under Arthur White, but also Dr. Siegfried Horn. I studied the Spirit of Prophecy under Arthur White and under Siegfried Horn, archaeology. And it was quite fascinating because he had studied archaeology and he could read these hieroglyphs like you could read your newspaper. And it was quite fascinating because of that. Well, Egypt is fascinating even from the point of view of its temples and its rescue operations. Now, I was sitting on the Aswan Dam here. This is a huge dam. when you fly over it, you actually literally fly for an hour or so. It was just tremendous. And what actually happened was that when they built the dam, then the water level came up, and some of these temples were flooded. And so what they did, they got these temples stone by stone, brick by brick, and they rebuilt them on higher ground, on islands that were higher. And this is the Philae Temple. I always love to take folks there when we're doing a trip. But the most fascinating one was further down the Aswan Dam towards Sudan. And this was the temple of Ramesses and Nefertari. Now, Nefertari was one of his wives, his most beautiful wife. And down here was where they had their temples. And they knew that that was all going to be covered in water. Now, today, Egypt is so poor, there's no way that they could do anything about it. So what happened was the UNO got together, they got huge millions of dollars, and they mounted this great rescue. And so they got to with these temples, they cut them bit by bit and took them up here and reassembled them. And so when you go to see this, look, this is the temple of Abu Simbel. All that was reconstructed. Just a most fascinating thing. I can never look at this other than I think, wow, when I was there, I think it was about 110 degrees. And the last time I was there, I hardly even saw it because some of my folk were just fainting so much, and I was the tour leader. I was looking after them more than sightseeing. But anyhow, that just gives you an idea of how huge they are. This is Egypt, and it's a very fascinating place. But perhaps the most outstanding thing has been the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. And of course, that really captures people's imagination. To go there, you go across the Nile, you go west. And that's where you get that expression. They used to bury their people the west of the Nile. And so they used to say, when a person's died, they've gone west. Well, I didn't like it very much because I was brought up in Perth. And, you know, when the folks from the eastern states would come west, it had a different meaning. All right, so there we are, and we're going across there. And you go to the Valley of the Kings, and it's in the Valley of the Kings that Tutankhamun's tomb was. This is Tutankhamun's tomb just there. But why they didn't discover it for many, many decades was Ramesses VI's tomb was here, and the rubble from his tomb, when they excavated it, was thrown over the entrance from Tutankhamun's tomb. So when they came across this rubble, they didn't realise that under the rubble was another tomb, and that's what put them off. And it's a very fascinating story of how they discovered it. Eventually, of course, they came down and they dug it all out and so forth. And then Howard Carter, when he got to the door of the tomb and it was sealed, there was the particular seal, and on it it had the name Tutankhamun. There was great excitement because they knew that this was a tomb that nobody had found, and hopefully they were hoping that nobody had ever disturbed it. So Howard Carter immediately got in contact with his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon got out on the fastest boat to Egypt, and then they reopened the tomb. And Howard Carter, they just knocked a hole in it, and he's looking through, and he's got a candle, and he's just looking through. Everywhere was the glint of gold. And Lord Carnarvon was behind him, very British. And he said, "What do you see?" And Howard Carter says in his best British accent, "Many wonderful things." And that, of course, was always considered the understatement of the century. Well, in here was all these marvellous items and treasures that had been buried with the king. But he was only a boy king, you see. And everybody just said, wow, if it had been, say, Tutankhamun, at least it had been Tutmosis III, a great warrior like him, or some of the Ramesses II, what would have been buried with those people? Just amazing. This was Anubis, of course. He was supposed to be the god of the underworld. The Egyptians just worshipped everything that crept and crawled. This is, some of you folks may recognise Mark Wilson here, and this was in the Berlin, at least the Cairo Museum, but this was what they had was like golden garages, for the want of something better, and there were three of them over one each, and then in this was the sarcophagus with the mummy in it, but the mummy was in three coffins, one inside of another, a little bit like, have any of you folks ever seen these Russian dolls? You know, you open them up and there's another one and another one. Well, that's about the best way to describe these two. The second gold coffin, it was largely gold plated, but yes, and here is Howard Carter examining the third gold coffin, and that coffin was solid gold. And we'll have a look at this a little bit closer. Yes, look at it. Yes, marvellous. And when you look at this, is the mask then that was on the mummy. But we're inclined to say, wow, look at the gold. And that gold's about as thick as your little finger. But remember, that blue is lapis lazuli, and that in itself is the equivalent of rubies or emeralds or something like that. So if you could just imagine that if this was all rubies and emeralds that had been fitted in, what would be the value? Well, and then, of course, finally, there was the mummy of the king here. Well, they have Tutankhamun back in his tomb. He's about the only one who's still in his tomb. Well, when we go to the Cairo Museum, I always say to the folks, get there as soon as you can. Be ready for when the doors open. Then I say to the folks, as soon as the doors open, don't look at anything there as you go in the front door. Just go straight in and up the stairs and right to the back and get as fast as you can to the treasures of Tutankhamun before everybody else gets there. And so I often say to them, look, have a look here though before we go, before the gates open up. This is very interesting. This is papyrus. We'll come back and have a look at that a little later. Something very fascinating with what God said in the Bible about papyrus there. And so what happens was, I'd say to the folks, quick, up the stairs and here, and all this area there is just devoted to Tutankhamun's treasures in his display room. And so, of course, to get up there, and here, it's just fascinating. Here, just in this glass box, and there it is. And you go around and you can have a good look at it. You see, the thing is this, it is hollow. I always thought that it was just the front, but no, it goes right over. Look, I'll show you. I took photos there. Okay, the front of it, but that's the back of it, you see? And it would go right over his head. And as you look here, this is gold. Wow. What's the price of gold now? Well, there it is. And when you think of all of this beautifully fitted with these rich stones, and of course the treasures here, the thrones and the chariots of Egypt, and the boxes. And this is for perfume. You just go, and you're just looking all the time. Gold, gold, gold. Here they were, guarding it. And look at this. This is just, I think this was a bed head, if you please. I'm glad it's not on our bed head. I don't think my wife would ever go to bed. But anyhow, but the gold, you see, and look at the lapis lazuli there. And the glass eyes, you know, this is going back 3,000 years ago or more. And gold knives. Oh, wait a minute, we better go back, sorry. Now, here's the third coffin. And in August, I was taking some lectures up at Hervey Bay, so I got the very latest. But since this time, yes, gold has gone up again. Look at the... Now, this weighed, if you please, 110 kilos of gold. And in Australian money, a couple of months ago, it was 42,000. I think it's more like 45,000 or something per kilo. In other words, it's about $5 million worth just of gold there, without the other thing, without all this beautiful stones here. Well, so much for the background of Egypt. But what does the Bible say? And it really adds to us. See, in Hebrews 11:24, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the temporary pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked forward to the reward. And when we actually get an idea of the treasures of Egypt that Moses turned aside in order to follow God, you know, that makes a tremendous challenge for us. If we were back there in the time of Moses, would have we been swept away by all of these treasures, or would have we stood up for what is true? And, well, amazing prophecies of Egypt. And remember about the papyrus. Okay, here in Isaiah 19 and verse 7, some of you have got your Bibles, and you may even want to jot down or mark some of these texts. They are fascinating. Here it says, the papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the river shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. Wow. Now, Isaiah wrote about 700 years before Christ. So this is going back 2,700 years ago, and God said that the papyrus, the reeds there by the River Nile, were all going to disappear. Well, what is it? Let's have a look. So you go to the Cairo Museum, and in the front of the Cairo Museum here, you see they've got the papyrus. But they have never been able to grow papyrus here or anywhere else in Egypt. And in my visits, one of the interesting things I find is when I've gone to Cairo, I've loved to have a look and see what condition the papyrus is in. And usually it's either dying or they've just replaced it. They just bring it in pots from way down in Egypt, at least in Africa. And yes, here, as you can see by the photo, I'm a little younger than what I am now. Well, yeah, what was that? That was 1953, 1983. Oh, I was only 51 then. I was born in 32. So you're looking at a dinosaur tonight, as you can see. Okay, but you see, back there, look at the papyrus reeds. They were just about died out. What they'd have to do, bring in more. And this curse that God put on them right back there 2,700 years ago, you know, when God says something, he means it. And it's still there. Why do the papyrus reeds keep dying in Egypt? And it's quite fascinating. Yes, well, these are just newly put in pots. They like to, yes, the ancient Egyptians were the first to make paper. And this is how they made paper. I found it very fascinating. They would get the papyrus reeds and they would split them down with a very sharp knife. You can see it split down there. And then they would put that in paper. And it has a sort of a gum connected with it. And then they would get to, and they would lay it on a piece of wood. And they'd put the strips one way and strips the other way. It almost looked like a basket weave, but it's not, of course. And then they would then put a press on it and leave it to dry. And there's enough natural sort of gum in the reed to glue it together. And when it dries, well, there it is, and they've got their paper. And even today you can go to Egypt and you can buy paintings and all sorts of things. I came home with a whole lot of them, and my next door neighbour, when we moved up to Queensland, was Egypt crazy. My wife said, "It's time you got rid of some of that junk. I can't get into the garage, let alone into your room." So I made a good fellow of myself and said to my next door neighbours, "Would you like some papyrus paintings?" And they were just so delighted they got to and framed them and so forth. But it was papyrus, and they're still using it today. Well, but the interesting thing is, earlier this year, I was lecturing in Uganda. In fact, I was right on the Congo border running a mission there, and we went from Kampala some hundreds of kilometres through to the Congo border, and as we were going over areas that were the headwaters of the Nile. There's some places where they were draining from Lake Victoria. But as we were going in the bus, I felt like saying to the bus driver, "Can you please just slow up? I want to get some photos of this. This means a lot to me." Because as you looked out, look, there were miles or kilometres of papyrus reeds. And this is the headwater of the Nile. But as soon as it gets to Egypt, bang, they can't grow. God said no, and that was it. And the interesting thing was that God said no because they were using it for pornographic literature back there. Well, here we are. Papyrus is still extinct in Egypt. And here, some of you folks may remember the Ra expeditions. And what they did was they got papyrus and they made these boats. They tried to imitate the ancient Egyptians. But they said no papyrus grows in Egypt now. There is plenty of stone if you want to build a pyramid, but not enough papyrus for a toy dinghy. Isn't that interesting? And that's how they have it there. Well, God said, you see, the papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown in the river shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. And that is exactly as it is. Well, it's the Bible behind that, and let's move on now. And here in Ezekiel 30, 12 and 13, God said, "I will sell the land into the hand of the wicked, and I will make the land waste and all that is therein by the hand of strangers. I, the Lord, have spoken it, and there shall be no more a prince in the land of Egypt." God said there will never be a prince in the land of Egypt. And that was written in the time of Ezekiel. That's about 600 years before Christ, 2,600 years ago. And friends, never again was there an Egyptian prince. Now, some of you folks that are my age will say, "Hey, but we remember King Farouk. Wasn't he a prince, a king in Egypt?" Do you know what? King Farouk was an Albanian. He was not an Egyptian. There had never been an Egyptian. After all, when Cleopatra was queen of Egypt, was she an Egyptian? No, she was a Greek. Cleopatra, very Greek. Okay, so here we are. And the longest line of kings of any nation, yet for the last 2,500 years, every king has been a foreigner. So when God says something, there it is. There shall be no more a prince in the land of Egypt. Well, here he also said, "I will also destroy the idols, and I will cause the images to cease from Memphis." And here you've got it mentioned. Okay, we go to Egypt. We take a tour group here. This Egyptologist, Amelia Edwards, she wrote in the book, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. And this is all that remains of Memphis: elders of cities, a few rubbish heaps, a dozen or so broken statues, and a name. Where are the stately ruins that even in the Middle Ages extended over a space estimated at half a day's journey in every direction? One can hardly believe that a great city ever flourished on this spot, or can hardly understand how it should have been effaced so utterly. Well, let's go and you have a look. This is just an insert here, but where are they? You go to this place, it's hard to believe that there was ever a great city. I mean, it would be like saying a city like New York would be so destroyed that there wouldn't be anything there to, where are the temple ruins and so forth? Here, Bible prophecy fulfilled. You just look out. They've dragged back a few stones, images for the tourists, but otherwise they're all gone, exactly as the Bible said. And so here the papyrus reads, be no more of prints, the images to cease from Memphis. But then God went on and said, they'll rule no more over the nations. It shall be the lowest of kingdoms. I'll make the land desolate. I'll diminish them. You know, to get the picture, Egypt at this time was the greatest nation of the world. It'd be like saying the Americans, the American nation will go down, and they will not only go down, but they'll never rise again. You see, you've had other nations down through the years that have gone down, but many of them have risen again. But Egypt would go down, never to come back. It says, they shall be a lowly kingdom. It shall be the lowliest of kingdoms. And when you go there, your heart goes out to these people. They're lovely people. And I've taken meetings in our church in Cairo. And, you know, these are just such lovely people. But it's a very lowly kingdom. And it shall never again exalt itself among the nations. I will diminish them so that they will not rule over the nations anymore. Ezekiel 29:15. And here, the peculiar doom of Egypt was that it was to be diminished. Century by century, it gradually shrank in importance, both politically and economically, until all the old wealth was gone, the people were poverty-stricken, and the country was reduced until it was a base kingdom. This is Floyd Hamilton writing in his book, Basis of the Christian Faith. Exactly as God foretold was going to happen. This was meat delivery, Egyptian style. And I'll never forget when we were settling into our hotel, there was only one other Adventist in our group. And these folks had sort of made some comments about this particular person and me being vegetarians. They were sort of kind, but you could sort of feel a little bit of a joke, you know, there with the end of the joke. I tell you what, when we got to Cairo, our whole group became instant vegetarians. They hadn't even cut the tail off the donkey. And the flies were around, and oh boy, you know. Now, true, that was a few years ago, but I don't think things have improved a great deal. Well, the pride of a power shall come down. I shall make the land of Egypt desolate, and the country shall be destitute of that wherein it was full. Bible predictions have proven true. Well, why were these judgments made against Egypt? It was because Egypt got God's people and held them down, made them slaves, and was so cruel. And God sort of stands by, and he said, you touch my people and you will pay for it. And it's just interesting. History, archaeology and history give us answers and confirm the biblical records of God's people in Egypt. And it's quite fascinating. You know, I was talking to David Down just the other day, and he is nearly 93. And he said, oh, I get so upset. He said, you know, there are these documentaries that are put on the television, usually for Sunday night, Saturday night, over the weekend, sort of saying there is no archaeological evidence to prove the Bible true. And he said, if only they would get their chronology right and not go along with that Egyptian priest, Manetho, and just contract it, as Velikovsky, the Jewish historian, says, it's all fits in. Well, let's have a look at some of these things just quickly. Josephus. This is fascinating. Josephus was a Jewish historian just after the time of Christ, about the time of the destruction of the temple. And he wrote, he wrote about Abraham arriving in Egypt. And this is what he wrote. This is a picture, an artist's impression of Abraham and his family arriving there. But look what he wrote. He communicated to them arithmetic and delivered to them the science of astronomy. For Before Abraham came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning, for that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt, and from there to the Greeks also. Isn't that fascinating? According to this this is a Jewish historian who had access to records in the time of Christ that have long been destroyed in the great university or the great libraries of the world that have been destroyed by fire. So we've lost those records, unfortunately. But here he's saying Abraham brought to them science, arithmetic and science of astronomy. Okay, if you get, following David Downes' readjustment of chronology, then when he agrees with it. First of all, they have in Ur of the Chaldees, around that area, they've discovered these, this is the cuneiform writing, this is now in the Louvre in Paris, but these were solving mathematical problems. Now that's going back 7 or 8 centuries before Christ, and or more, at the time of Abraham, going back well before that. Well, okay, now I was telling you about the pyramid that Jack built. Okay, this is it, look at it. And you can see that. Look, there's just nothing coordinated there at all. But going by the revised chronology that David Downes would recommend, this was before Abraham's arrival in Egypt. And that's how they were building pyramids. But if we go now to the 4th dynasty, just the next dynasty, suddenly, boom, something happens. Look, north and south, they're just straight. And when you're looking, and according to the revised chronology, this would be the time that Abraham came into Egypt. It becomes very fascinating. David Downes has written a book, Unwrapping the Pharaohs, and he's just written another one on archaeology that is now being used in schools as a textbook. But look, you see, they reckon that these 3 pyramids were lined up like the 3 stars of Orion's belt. Now tomorrow I'm going to speak about Christ coming back through the opening in Orion. You'll be just absolutely fascinated with it. If you've got friends, bring them along, because it's a great, and I've got some of the latest pictures from NASA. We as a people, as Seventh-day Adventists, have been so blessed with the information that we've been given. But just look at it, right there, north and south, east and west. And according to Josephus, he said, before Abraham came, they had no knowledge of arithmetic or of astronomy. But when Abraham came, but friends, the Egyptians, it didn't last long. Well, one dynasty, that might have been 100 years or so. And look, this was the 5th dynasty. This is the Pyramid of Unas. Now, to be fair, the stone robbers have got in and they've taken the stones, the casing away. But nevertheless, what a poor sort of pyramid that is compared with the great pyramids of the 4th dynasty. Well, The Pyramid Builders is a book written by Rosalie David. Professor Rosalie David came out to Australia a few years ago, and she is a friend of David Downes. She's the curator in charge of the Manchester Museum, and with the archaeological side there in Manchester. And she wrote this book about the pyramid builders of ancient Israel. And we have this question, were these Israelite slaves? Now, we go back to Josephus, the Jewish historian. I've got his book and I've read all these passages. In fact, the other week I was taking a service on this and I had the book right there, and it was quite fascinating. And here he wrote, the Egyptians set them also to build what? Pyramids. Now, the Bible never says that they were set to build pyramids. The Bible says they were set to make bricks out of what? Mud and straw. Josephus now goes a step further and says, yes, but some of the things that they were to build were pyramids. So if this is true, we should expect to see mud and straw brick pyramids in Egypt. Certainly not the ones in Giza, they're all of stone. But there are mud and straw brick pyramids, and I've taken tour groups there. And here it is. This is in Kahun, and look at the pyramid there. That is made of mud and straw bricks. Let's have a look. And this is Joseph's Canal. That is very, very fascinating, Joseph's Canal. In fact, we went up. This is 1983. Since that time, they won't let people go up the pyramids. And I'm so glad they don't let them go up anymore. After I've been up, of course. And anyhow, I can still remember we came up here and climbed up. Yes, mud and straw brick there. And this is Joseph's Canal. And here is an oasis where 2 or 3 million people could have lived. It seemed that Joseph had brought this canal. In fact, if you get a map, you will see Bahar means canal in the Arabic language, and it's Joseph's Canal. And it goes for many, many miles, and it comes into this depression, and it brought down mud and silt, and that's where I believe that the Hebrews came after they had been up in Goshen. Well, and this is the site of the town where the pyramid builders lived. And they lived here by their thousands, hundreds of thousands. There's David Down leading his group there, and we were going through. This area was originally excavated by Flinders Petrie. So Flinders Petrie was a great person, archaeologist, up until the First World War. And then, of course, he had to stop. But he said, this would have been the Israelites, only it's not the right time. David Down says, get the right chronology, and wow, you've got all that information there. And so, look, this is pottery. What sort of crowd were here if this is just the pottery that they threw out? It just goes on and on here. Yeah, so I was with an Indian that Pastor David Down had, I think he'd brought him into the church, and he paid for him to come on our tour group there. But here we were, picking up pieces of pottery, because everybody imagines, wow, wouldn't it be marvellous if we could just put it all together, you know, and so forth. Nobody ever did, but yes. Where did it come from? And it's not just a few. It just goes on and on there. Well, look at this. And there you got one pyramid built of mud and straw bricks, and there's another pyramid. This is the pyramid of Sesostris II. That's Amenhotep III. That's the one we went up. And yes, look, mud and straw bricks here. And this is the one that we went up. I think David Down took a photo. Yes, here I am at the top here. And that's what we travelled out. This was the post there. And this fellow, I'll never forget, the Egyptian guard decided he wanted a bit of baksheesh. So he left his post and came with us. Now, let me say this. This is off the beaten track for the average tourist, which is tragic, because I would dearly love, you know, it just undermines the whole biblical story. And so we went up there, and I'm hanging on to this mud and straw brick, and I'm thinking to myself, I wonder who made this. I wonder if this was Amram or Jochebed, you know. It just makes the whole biblical story come to life here, there. And along the streets where the pyramid builders lived, mud and straw bricks, look. And this is the houses. And here they just daubed it, and this is where they lived. Here's a town plan of the pyramid builders. Hundreds of thousands of them, no doubt, the slaves of Egypt. But, and these are some of the building tools, you see here, this mud brick mould. They would mix up the mud and straw, then they'd push it down with their feet, and then they would just lift this up, and they'd pull the mud brick out. When I was in Uganda earlier this year, they were making some of these mud and straw bricks to make a house for our pastor there. But these are some of the building tools. Then we go and household articles. You know, you look at these, you think, wow, these could have been, you know, part of Moses' family. Some of his relatives could have had these, but workman's tools that they had. But Rosalie David, she wrote, something weird happened. There were hundreds and thousands of these slaves. They were not Egyptians. They were foreign slaves that came from the east. In other words, from Palestine. And something happened we can't explain, that suddenly these folks just left their tools, left their implements, and took off. We can't work it out. You get your Bible, and it's right there, but they haven't got the chronology right. Pastor David Down gets very, very frustrated over this, you know, and then you'll read on, or you'll listen on television, and they're saying there is nothing, no archaeological evidence to prove the biblical story. And this is what is being fed today, and Australia and the world is becoming more and more secular. Well, it even gets greater than this. Look, burial of children. This is from Rosalie David's book, Pyramid Builders. Burial of children in wooden boxes underneath the floors of houses was an accepted custom of funerary practices there. But, look at this. Many newborn infants were found buried in the floors of the rooms. David Down, when he was in Manchester there, he said to Rosalie David, have you got any of the bones of the babies that were in these boxes? And she said, unfortunately, they've been lost. David said, what a shame. He said it would be very interesting to see whether these will do a DNA test and see if they were baby boys. Remember the story of Moses. Just confirmed the whole thing. Okay, well, just moving ahead. The departure, she said, was sudden and unpremeditated, exactly as the Bible story says. Well, here it is, and that night, the night of the Passover, and the time came when God was taking his people to the promised land. You know, doesn't that get us excited to think, wow, we are ready to cross over to go into Jordan, you know? And God is getting a people that he's leading again today. And just the same as he led his people when the time was right, so he's... And as you go down through here, there's all this biblical evidence. The only thing, it's in the 12th and the 13th dynasty. And if you get your chronology right, that is when it would have taken place. That there's evidence there of foreigners, Jews, came into the country. Mud and brick food storehouses were built. There was a famine after years of plenty. Slaves building mud and straw bricks and pyramids, we've just seen that. There were plagues. The Nile became blood. And then some tragedy overtook Egypt and its army so the Hyksos could walk in and take it over. Just looking at these very quickly. This is a painting. Some of you folks remember seeing this painting. It's a painting from a wall of a tomb. And these are people coming into Egypt, and they were not Egyptians. How do we know they're not Egyptians? Look at the men. There's something about those men there that indicate they were not Egyptians. Can you guess? The Egyptians were clean-shaven, remember? And these were Jews. They were coming in, and look at these folks with their coats of many colours, the Jewish people. Well, the second point is mud and straw brick storehouses were built. This is fascinating. This is around the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, and these are all mud and straw brick storehouses. In fact, once it was entirely mud and straw bricks, but of course Ramesses came and got rid of them and built his mortuary temple in the middle. But let's go and have a look at it just here. And David Downaway used to love to take a tour group there. So we took our tour group through. And look, mud and straw bricks, and they would daub it here. And then they could seal it on the top. And because there was no rain there in Egypt, in this particular part, they could preserve the corn. And providing they kept all the vermin out, all was well. And this is what happened. Here, a famine after years of plenty. And this is an inscription. The Nile has not overflowed for a period of 7 years. Herbage fails. The storehouses were built. All that was in them has been consumed. And so you've got the records there. And this is quite fascinating. Amoni, who was an official under Sosostris I, we believe that this was the Pharaoh of Joseph that was so kind to him. But on Amoni's tomb wall, as you read the story here and the hieroglyphs, it tells this story and says, and this is Bruch, who was quite an historian, Egyptologist, no one was unhappy in my days, not even in the, notice there, years of famine. For I had tilled all the fields in the nome, or the area of Mar, up to its southern and northern frontiers. Thus I prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food which it produced. No hungry man was in it. Very interesting. Records recording the fact, years of famine. And here we've got another one, this nobleman Bibi, and he's virtually saying the same thing. What I love about the Egyptians, they just love themselves. I'm a good guy. Nobody ever wrote anything about them that was negative. Then, point 4, slaves building mud and straw pyramids. And we just had a look at these, you see. And there on the walls of the tombs are the paintings. And doesn't that bring back memories? Remember, Moses got into trouble for seeing one of his own being beaten, and that led him to... Then, point number 5. There were plagues, the river became blood. And this is the Ipuwer Papyrus. This was in the Leiden Museum. This is in Holland. And this is what it says. Plague stalketh through the land, and blood is everywhere. Nay, but many dead men are buried in the river. Nay, but the river is what? Blood. Nay, but corn hath perished. Everywhere the storehouse is bare. And this Ipuwer Papyrus goes on and on with this poem lament of the plagues, which we would understand very clearly to be the plagues. And so here we've got it, you see. And the river became blood. There's all the evidence in the world if we get the right time. But we've been derailed in history, in chronology, by this Manetho, who was an Egyptian spiritualist priest. Get the idea? And people will take what Manetho says before the biblical chronology. Well, coming to our last points now. Some tragedy overtook Egypt and its army, so the Hyksos could walk in and take it over without having to fight a battle. Does that sound ominous? Something happened to the Egyptian army. So these people, these foreigners, were able to walk in and take Egypt over. Okay, let's have a look at this a little closer. Manetho, who I'm talking about, the Egyptian historian, he wrote, there was a king whose name was Timaeus. Under him it came to pass, I know not how, that God was averse to us, and there came, after a surprising manner, men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts, and had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and with, notice this word, with ease, subdued it by force, yet without our hazarding a battle with them. Wow, doesn't that support the Bible? The thing was, the Egyptian army and the Pharaoh were all at the bottom of the Red Sea. And these folks were able to move in. And yes, well, the Bible says, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, and all the host of Pharaoh, there remained not so much as one of them. And so the Hyksos. According to Velikovsky, and here was the Jewish historian that wrote the book Ages in Chaos, he maintains that these Hyksos were the Amalekites. And as the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, they met the Amalekites coming in to take Egypt over. And so that would be, you see, they were free to subdue Egypt with ease without hazarding a battle. Well, archaeology has corroborated the substantial historicity of the biblical record. And F.F. Bruce, in J.A. Thompson, The Bible and Archaeology, this is what he says, and we've got here, these breathtaking discoveries, whose significance it is impossible to grasp at once, make it necessary for us to revise our views about the Bible. Many events which previously passed for pious tales must now be judged to be historical. Don't you wish that we could get material like this and put it on television, when these folks have got time on television to say there is nothing to substantiate the biblical record, and here it all is. Well, there's all the evidence for us to believe. And my great wish is that God's people, we can get grounded in our faith and our confidence in the Word of God to stand by it and to promote it. Well, from the people of Egypt, good night and God bless. Okay, just one last little thing. And a safe trip home. Well, tonight I'd like to say, who would like to join with me and say, God, by your grace, I want to have greater faith in the Word of God, and I just pray that you're a special blessing. Good. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. Our loving Father in heaven, tonight we just thank you and praise you that we've got a God who stands by his word. We thank you that the word of God is reliable, it's trustworthy. And as we look at the closing events of Earth's history, it gives us confidence to know that the same God that opened the Red Sea, the same God that opened the River Jordan, is about to open up again and lead his people through to the promised land. We just pray that your special blessing will be with us over this Sabbath. We pray it may be a very special Sabbath. We'll be drawn closer to thee and to one another. And Lord, just help us and prepare us for your coming, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.